Hi, and welcome to this very special panel celebrating the documentary production team Namaka Oka Āina as part of the 10th San Diego Asian Film Festival Spring Showcase. Before we begin, I wanted to thank our community partners for this event. So I want to shout out our panel sponsors, the San Diego State University APITA Center, the UCSD Pacific Islander Student Association, and UCSD Spaces. And of course, we want to give a huge shout out to our longtime sponsor, Pacific Islanders in Communication, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. For 3 decades, they played a central role in funding and promoting Pacific Islander media. We're so grateful to be supported by this storied organization, especially on their 30th anniversary. So we're actually going to be able to talk a little bit about PIC today, because we actually have on our panel Pacific Islanders in Communication Executive Director Leanne Ferrer. We also have with us Director Anthony Banua-Simon, Director of Cane Fire. And last and certainly not least is the star of today's show. We are honored and delighted to have one of the members of Namaka Oka Āina, Joan Lander. So thank you all for being here today. This is going to be, I like to keep this fairly casual. So, I mean, even though I'm kind of moderating this, I'll be asking questions. If any of you want to jump, if you like a question pops to your head and you wanted to ask Joan or each other, feel free to do so. And then, of course, we have an audience who is joining us via Facebook, Twitch, YouTube. Thank you all for being here. And if you have any questions, feel free to add them in the chat boxes of your respective platforms. And they'll be funneled to me. You don't have to wait till the end to ask questions. I mean, so as soon as you have questions, feel free to ask them, and I'll integrate them into our conversation. Okay. All right, so today we're looking at the history and legacy of Namaka Oka Āina, which is made up of the filmmakers Joan Lander and the late Pujipal. Since 1974, they've made over 100 documentaries about Hawaiian culture, history, language, art, music, and politics. Their work has been screened all around the world at film festivals and on television. And we're thrilled to actually be able to include 3 of them at our showcase this year. So we have Active War, the overthrow of the Hawaiian nation, the Tribunal, and Mauna Kea, Temple Under Siege. All right, so we're gonna have a lot of questions for Joan today. So just so Leanne and Anthony, you don't feel left out of this conversation, I actually wanted to maybe start by asking you two a question, which is, when was the first time you had heard of Namaka Oka Āina or their work? Maybe Leanne, why don't you start?
I had to remember to unmute myself. First off, before we start, I just want to honor Pujipal. And this is the 5th year of his passing. And Joan has lived with it every day, with his memory and carrying on the legacy. So to you, Pujipal, aloha. And thank you, Joan, for carrying on the legacy. You know, it'd be really easy to just say, okay, I'm done, you know, did my job, but you are still here. You are still so relevant in our community, in the filmmaking world, and to the activists and the advocates today. You know, you are a source of inspiration. So thank you. And going to when I first heard of Namaka Oka Āina, it was from Active War, and I was a technician at PBS Hawaii, a student technician. I was going to the University of Hawaii, and I could work there for 20 hours a week, as long as I was carrying 12 credit hours. And they were shooting a few things in the studio. And were you based there too, Joan? I can't remember if that was your base.
Hawaii Public Television?
Yeah.
No, we have a lot of our early, we have a lot of programming down there, but yeah, I never was employed.
Oh, but yeah, when you were doing the film, were you working through there? Because that's how I first heard of you.
Well, like I say, some of our programming went on PBS Hawaii over the years.
Yeah. So anyway, so that was back in the early 90s.
How about you, Anthony? Oh, you're on mute, by the way.
Okay, so won't happen again. For me, it was seeing the Waimanalo eviction, the short documentary, just very, very visceral, you know, of people being displaced from the encampment, and it just was so intense and upsetting and so emotional, and immediately, you know, being thrown into what was happening with the police evicting them, but then also Pujipal like offering his commentary. It was just like a very, just felt like such a thorough picture in a small amount of time of what was happening. And after that, it was Mauna Kea Temple Under Siege, when I wanted to learn more about what was happening in Mauna Kea. And it was such a perfect, again, summary, encapsulation, both if you wanted to take a more scientific argument against the telescopes, but also really appreciating the spiritual side of it and giving it as much space and respect. And it really comes across of how meaningful it is. And it was just a perfect piece. And then I watched Active War and the 1993 discussion as well, which was really fantastic. And then also her shorts, I think was the triennial, maybe a couple months ago of that were, you know, following some musicians. So also films that were, you know, some that were very political, but some that are light and have this breath and the music and kind of a light tone to them. So it's a very diverse mix, and I love it. It's so powerful.
Yeah, when we were putting together this program, we had so much to choose from, and it was such a blessing to be able to dive into that archive and see them all. So Joan, tell us, like, how did this all start, right? Like, when did you first meet Pujipal? How did you just decide to make documentaries together?
I had been doing video production for quite a while before I met Pujipal, but when I first came to Hawaii, I saw what was going on here. I come from an activist background. You know, I was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and I worked with migrant farm workers in Colorado trying to improve their working conditions and wages. And so I was kind of like, you know, leaning towards social justice issues. I moved to Hawaii, got involved with Life of the Land, which was an environmental organization. So I got to know, through that, I got to see what was going on, how the land was being used and abused, and how the people of this place, the Kanakamoli, the real people of this place, were being dispossessed of their land. And so I, back in then, small format video equipment was first starting to come out. So all of a sudden, people like me had access to the media, and cable TV was coming out. And in Hawaii, there was like 85 to 90% subscription to the cable TV stations, because there's so many mountains on the islands that a lot of people couldn't get over-the-air reception. So everybody signed up for cable TV. And there was the public access channel, which proved to be a main venue for many, many years. We would just shoot stuff, produce it, and put it on public access, and train community members in doing it too. But I felt a real need to tell the story about what was happening with the first people, and didn't feel comfortable doing that as an outsider to the culture and a newcomer to Hawaii. So when Pujipal was involved in a land rights struggle at Sand Island, he was being documented by another video production team called Windward Video, Jerry Rochford and Victoria Keith. And they came to my facility, my video company's facility, to do the editing. And they brought Pujipal in to do the narration for the opening of the program. And that program ended up going on one of the first PBS series that had independent video productions. The series was called Matters of Life and Death. And Pujipal saw the power of video, because that thing aired on PBS stations around the country. And it was also taken up to, you know, the United Nations and shown there. And the video covered the eviction of the people who had settled at Sand Island, which is an island in the middle of Honolulu Harbor. anyway, that you can watch that. The Sand Island story is available online. But so he saw the power of video, and he wanted to do it himself. He wanted to tell more of the story of Hawaii and the history, and like I say, that's the story of dispossession. So I wanted to help him out. So we formed a team, and that was the beginning. And since then we made like maybe about 100 videos of various levels of, production quality. But yeah, so I was real happy. He was real happy. We made a pretty good team.
And so, I mean, speaking of the team, like, how did you split up the work? Like, were there certain things that you specialized in, or Pujipal specialized in, or was it, or did it sort of change with every project?
I mostly did camera. He mostly did audio. He didn't have a video background, so I was showing him, training him in the camera, but he couldn't handle camera. His eye, he couldn't keep on like that when you have to look into the viewfinder. It drove him crazy. But but he liked audio, and so he was mostly, na mako ka Āina means the eyes of the land. But when he would introduce us, he would say that I'm the eyes and he's the ears of the land, because he did audio. But as far as the direction of what we produced and shot, we co-produced and co-directed, and it was mostly, I always would bow to him as far as what subject matter we would be covering in the next program. But in a way, it wasn't, things were just kind of put on our plate, I mean, there was a land action here and a water rights issue there and the burial issue here, so we were just constantly grabbing the equipment and rushing out to the latest eviction or, rally or whatever, countless hours of public hearings. So, but then, interestingly enough, I had to give him the camera whenever there was a helicopter shoot or shooting from a boat, because I get deathly seasick and airsick, and I've shot out of helicopters many, many times. And every time it was, I got the shot, but I was totally sick, so I was really happy that he could handle that kind of stuff. I just said, just keep a wide angle Pujipal and point in the right direction, you'll get it. And he did great. He was shooting right down into the erupting lava at 200, and he would sail along the coastline, because he used to be a merchant marine. He actually worked in the merchant marine for 10 years when he first got out of Kamehameha schools. So he was used to being on the water.
So if you're in a helicopter, I imagine these aren't necessarily, they're low budget, but you had some resources, right? So I'm curious, where did some of the resources come from?
For a while, well, like I said, I had my own I was part of a video company prior to meeting Pujipal. But then when I met him and we decided to work together, I quit that. So I had all of a sudden had no access to video equipment. So we had to, started doing an educational cultural series for the Department of Education for 4th through 6th graders. And it was just all Hawaiian cultural subjects. And it came out of the whole public effort to get more Hawaiian culture taught in the schools by kupuna, by cultural experts, and also the Hawaiian language. So we were part of that. And the money we got from that, which is very low budget, Department of Education is pretty low budget. We were at least able to buy our own camera. So then we were able to go shoot other things, like struggles, and then worked our way up. Pretty soon we were doing stuff for pay, or community groups would ask us to cover certain issues, and we'd say, well, can you afford to buy the tape? Can you afford this or that? And we'd start getting money. And then we started going after grants. And then after a while, we became the go-to people that cover all these social justice issues. So a lot of community groups like the Protect Kaho'olawi Ohana and the Hawaiian language organizations and stuff would just naturally come to us to do videos that they raised the money for, so we didn't have to do all the grant writing. And but with Active War, that was probably one of the first times we actually went out after our own big time grant. And that was ITVS, of the beginnings of the independent television service, which had just formed. And we were one of their first responding to their first RFP. And so we were thinking there's going to be all these independents, you know, applying for this money from all over the United States. So we just blue skied the budget. I mean, we just threw everything in the budget that we normally do for free, or we expect other people to do for free. And so it was this huge, you know, $300,000 budget. And we got the grant. And it was so funny because we heard from on the floor of the U.S. Congress in the Senate, some Republicans were holding up this list of all the people who had been given grants on the first ITVS grant making process. And there was ours, Act of War, the overthrow of the Hawaiian Nation. There was one on Leonard Peltier, political prisoner. There's one on the Black Panthers, you know. So one of these Republicans got up on the floor of the Senate and said, look what our taxpayers are funding, all this propaganda, you know. And so Senator Akaka, one of the senators from Hawaii, his office called us and said, what is this? What is this? And we said, well, you actually sent us a letter congratulating us on the grant. I think one of the underlings in the office, and that's like part of the thing they do, is they congratulate anybody in Hawaii that gets a federal grant. And we said, you can tell the other senators that Act of War was the words that Grover Cleveland, U.S. President Grover Cleveland, used to describe what happened in Hawaii. So what we realized then was what we needed. First of all, we were producing it in time for the 100th anniversary of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Nation in 1893. So 1993 was coming up. We had like a year and a half to get this out. And in doing the research, we found out that actually what happened in Hawaii was pretty much known in the United States back in those days. I mean, we were researching the newspapers, the New York newspapers and stuff like that. And there was a headline saying, was Hawaii stolen? You know, and stuff like that. So we thought people knew what was going on in Hawaii. There was different opinions about it. But so we thought, at least with this documentary, we can hopefully bring the American public up to the same level they were in 1893 with at least knowledge about what happened. And when it started going, it didn't make the national schedule with PBS. It was turned down for like Point of View and American Experience and that kind of stuff because they thought we were too polemical, is the word they used. And we admit we're advocacy journalists. And Pujipal always used to say, you know, they ask for balance on PBS, which is understandable. I mean, Leanne knows that really well. But we would think, Pujipal would say, 99% of what people see on TV is all from that point of view, from a Western point of view. Hawaii is a state, it's a paradise, it's a tourist paradise. That's all we need to know, you know. And he said, and now we only get 1 hour of public television time, and we're supposed to give half of that to that point of view. So we recognize, but still. So anyway, even though it didn't go on the national schedule, it was accepted by about 200. I forget how many public television stations downlinked it and aired it during the public broadcasting period. And we put an 800 phone number on the end of it for people to be able to call for free because we wanted to sell VHS copies of it. We wanted to go right into distribution. And instead, these Hawaiians, we would get these calls late at night or early in the morning from, you know, Utah or Boston or, you know, Washington State or something, and it would be this diaspora of Hawaiians living over in the United States, and they'd be calling this 800 number in tears, saying that their grandparents had told them about something that happened back in 1893, but they never knew what it was until they saw this program. So Pujipal, of course, was connecting with these long lost Hawaiians, and they would talk for, you know, and I go, Pujipal, get off the phone. We're probably missing a whole bunch of other calls. Anyway. So anyway, it showed, I mean, that program and all the other ones we did really showed how Hawaiians have been disappeared over the years. They just were disappeared. What they had to say, their faces, their stories, their history, their language, all of it had been disappeared. Not all of it, but in the main, you know. So we felt very blessed and called to do the work that we did.
So the story you're telling about Act of War, I think is really interesting because you said in the beginning, you saw a lot of what you did was, you know, for education in Hawaii on public access television, but suddenly you had to think about potentially a audience beyond Hawaii. So this is actually tied to one of the questions that someone's already asking about How did you sort of balance like this in some ways, like what you're doing is for the Hawaiian people, right? But also you have this opportunity now to speak beyond Hawaii. Like how were you very conscious of this shift, and how did you kind of manage that?
Yeah, one of the people that's in one of our other documentaries used to describe it as having to feed baby food to an American audience because it's not taught. They don't learn it in the school, so we have to kind of start from square one and kind of explain that Hawaii was an independent sovereign nation recognized by the great powers of the world back in the 1800s. It wasn't just some paganistic cannibalistic society like Hawaii was portrayed in the political cartoons of the time, but was recognized in the family of nations, was legitimate. It had 3 treaties of friendship, commerce, and navigation with the United States. So anyway, so we had to give all that. It was really hard to squeeze it all into an hour, I have to say. But on the other hand, I thought, well, we'll just show the history, from primary sources, because it wasn't in the history books. Let me tell you, we went to the history books, and hardly anything was ever written from a Hawaiian kingdom point of view. The only history historian that we found that actually presented it from a Hawaiian point of view was this African American scholar from Howard University in Washington, D.C., called Merce Tate. And anyway, she was an elderly person. By the time when we got to Washington, we called her up to thank her. But then part of me said, and Pujipal thought too, let's not try to talk. Our main focus has always been to the Hawaiian community here, so they would know their history. They would hear from each other. We were constantly hearing from people on the different islands saying, I can't believe I saw that program, and they're finding out that something's happening on Hawaii Island that they didn't know about on Kauai. So that was our main thing, is for the Hawaiian community. And I thought, if the outside world, let's just present the Hawaiian culture as it's presented. And if the outside world is interested, they can just dive into it and learn. And if they have questions about it, they can research it, or watch more programs or something. We didn't feel like we really had to mold the message too much to a non-Hawaiian audience or non-Hawaii audience.
So I actually What's that?
Well, we probably got, pigeonholed for that too, that we were the radicals, and it was propaganda. As the Republicans said in Congress.
So the stage you're setting here is really interesting, and because it's in this context too that Pacific Islanders and communications emerges. So Leanne, I'd love to hear also if you could speak to how PIC began in the early '90s, and what was its relationship with filmmakers like Joan and Pujipal.
PIC was started in the early '90s by filmmakers, including Joan and Pujipal. And we get our funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, CPB. We get about 85% of our funding from them right now. And there was another organization that was funding Asian content, and that was, it's now the Center for Asian American Media, but it used to be NATA. And the filmmakers at NATA were, of course, friends with our Pacific Islander filmmakers, and were saying, why don't you ask CPB for money too? And I know it sounds really simple. It was not simple, and it was highly political. And our filmmakers had to kind of storm the meeting that CPB was having with PBS Hawaii to get that funding go directly to them. So I'm so glad that they did. I'm glad that Pacific Islanders and Communications was formed. And although, yes, we do have to submit non-biased, all points of view, and I don't want to say cater to a national audience, but more of a universal audience. It is watered down. It's not like what Joan and Pujipal put out there. However, I'm really glad that our stories are getting out there. And, we look at it as all documentaries are a piece of art, or, even a poo-poo platter. Here's the information. You can take what you want from it. And I hope that they glom onto the side that really matters.
I actually like that you mentioned that documentary is also an art, because I feel like Joan and Pujipal's work is often talked about in terms of like educating people, but I also find your works kind of artful in their own way, and you there's a lot of creativity involved. I mean, I love that Act of War, the fact that the native scholars all look into the camera and no one else gets to look in the camera, I think is such a smart choice, and has a certain kind of like quality to it. Like, that to me is an aesthetic choice. Also, like seeing Pujipal in the film too is its own kind of like creative choice that isn't necessarily what a lot of other people in public television was doing. So Joan, I wonder if you could talk also about, did you see yourselves as artists too?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because our main event was telling what was going on. Look over here, look what's happening, you know, and that's all. Sometimes I can get kind of hard to stomach if you're a viewer. I mean, even now, if I have a choice to watch a documentary about some social justice issue or some romantic comedy, you know, I'm going to pick the romantic comedy, because sometimes you just get so inundated with all the stuff that's going wrong. So I thought, well, show the audience what is at stake here, what is under siege, like Mauna Kea. Show the beauty of Hawaii. I mean, we're lucky in that regard. Every place you point the camera, there's beauty. And we're lucky in the beauty of the Hawaiian culture, the music of the Hawaiian culture, the language, the concepts that the language brings up. It's all fascinating, to me anyway, as an outsider. And I thought, if it's fascinating to me, it's going to be fascinating to other people, because it's such a different mindset. The whole thing of living on islands, you know, and how you live on islands, that's something that a continental people have never experienced before. And I just love, Sam Ka'ai was one of the people we videotaped. I call him a philosopher, but he's a carver and an artist. And what he said one time in an interview is comparing Western culture with Hawaiian culture. He was saying, we're not better, we're just longer at it. And I just love that, because of course, people who have lived on islands, a society that's lived on islands for generation after generation, they've learned to live with limited resources, limited, you know, fishing, limited water, and they learn certain things, how to take care of those resources, and not just how to save them, but to enhance them. So you had the whole Hawaiian culture of fish ponds, which enhanced the production of the sea by, 500%. I forget what the percentage is, but they increased their food production, and then growing taro in watered terraces and stuff. That also increased the food production. So when their population went up, even though they were still on the limited resources of an island, they knew how to produce more and enhance nature by enhancing nature and not exploiting it, and also by sharing. I think, as an outsider, that's another thing. If you can live in Hawaii for years and years and years and never really know about the Hawaiian culture until you live with a Hawaiian. And that's why I'm so grateful for Pujipal for taking me in, because he was my passport into seeing what the Hawaiian culture is all about. And that idea of sharing, it just comes so naturally to Hawaiians, and it doesn't come naturally to somebody like me. And but I found after doing all our videos that actually is a survival. It's a method of survival, sharing. And that's not something that people who live on continents learn. They learn that there's so much land, they can exploit this land, and once it's all used up, they can move on to the next land. And you just can't do that on the island. So you share, the mountain people would share with the ocean people and stuff like that. And a lot of people say, well, you don't want to go back to that, and that's like a regression, going back to something like that. And one of the guys in the tribunal says, no, I don't want to go back. I want to go forward. I want to go forward to the fish ponds. I want to go forward to the lo'i. And that's what everybody's talking about now, sustainability, and making it so everybody in Hawaii can grow their own food instead of importing 90% of it.
Yeah, and thinking about the future, I mean, that to me is like why these films are so radical now. even because it's not just about what happened in the past, it's about how this is continuing today. And that's why I feel like the Tribunal seems so contemporary even now. I mean, these are all issues that are unresolved. Can you talk about how the Tribunal happened as a film? Like, is this something that, did you reach out to them? Did they reach out to you, or were you just sort of in the room with them all along?
Maka Āina was like this with the sovereignty movement. So I mean, whatever was happening in the movement, we were there. So it was just unquestioned that when the Tribunal was being dreamed up, that we would be documenting it. So we actually started doing it without that much funding, and it was pretty expensive. We had to go to 5 islands, and it happened over 10 days. But what I was really happy about is that we did active war. That showed what happened back then, but we only had like the last 3 minutes of active war to talk about the impact that had since 1893. So with the Tribunal, we were able to go to all the Hawaiian communities on the various islands and hear from people's personal stories on how they lost their land, how their water, their streams were polluted, how they can't get to their fishing grounds anymore because there's hotels. So all those, so that people could understand how they couldn't speak how they were punished for speaking their language when they were little kids and stuff. And there's nothing like those personal stories to really convince people. You can talk theoretically about international law and the overthrow and being a violation and, of treaties and stuff like that. But when you actually see the impact it had and still has on Hawaiians, and so many people come to Hawaii and they say they want to be Hawaiian wannabes, and they say, oh, I'm Hawaiian at heart, and Pujipal used to say, well, you want to be Hawaiian? You want to lose your family land? You want to not be able to fish on your fishing grounds? You want to go to be the most population in jail, the most people in jail? You want to have the highest incidence of infant mortality, the highest incidence of cancer and heart disease? Yeah, you can be Hawaiian. So it's kind of hard to say stuff like that. But anyway, that's what we tried to tell people, that it's not all sunshine, sex, and sand, as they say.
And that could be activism, and that's not a normal, that's not what people associate with Hawaiian society, that on at least in the United States, on sort of on the continent. I like the way you talked about how you and the movement were like this, right? Like it was always understood. You had that connection. So I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more on how you felt like your work with the Maka Āina was part of an activist movement. Did you feel like you were documenters of that movement, or were you part of the movement? And how did that affect the kinds of your approach to telling stories or doing interviews and that sort of thing?
Oh, Ryan, you asked such good questions.
This is what I want to know.
I don't have to articulate this stuff, so I'm not used to it. But very good questions. I think we were part of the movement. We documented it, and we were also part of furthering the movement all at one time. So, and by the way,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Or maybe I'm curious how Anthony would answer this question too, because Cane Fire has this also relationship with activists. So Anthony, maybe you could talk about your work in Cane Fire, like the relationship between you and activists. Sort of, are you documenters or are you kind of part of that movement? And then maybe, like in some ways, if you can reflect also on Joan and Pujipal's work and kind of how you see that as the relationship between documentary and activism.
Yeah, I saw myself as an ally to it, not in however they wanted to define it and control it. So I think I mentioned this before with you, Brian, but the relationship with the activists at Wailua was, they were in the middle of an action of restoring the land on this property. And it was interesting to me and kind of what I had been doing in the project. And I had talked to Keala, one of the activists you see in the documentary, for hours of just all these ideas, just all these associations, and the conversation was having with cocoa palms and all these things that were clashing. And they were really into that idea, but that wasn't, you know, they weren't doing this as as part of my project. Like they had their own purpose and initiative that was separate of that. So I think the agreement we came towards was I would film with them, and then afterwards, you know, they would focus on things that they thought was most important to their movement, and then I would share with them the footage for them to do whatever they want and to advocate this specific strategy that they had. And then I would use it, how it connected to my project, knowing that they were sympathetic to what was in my project, but knowing that it might not emphasize the same things that they would. So I think that was kind of the balance that we struck. But because the group had dispersed due to being kicked out by the developer, we didn't actually get to see that through. So I don't know how that would have worked or how that would have manifested, but it felt like the right thing, the right exchange at the time.
Mm.
You know, just to add one other thing about being documenters and being activists, we were covering the eviction of the Hansen's disease patients at Hawaii Mohalu back in the 80s. And Hansen's disease patients are people who have leprosy, what they call leprosy, and they were being evicted from their the main place that they had been given to live. Anyway, it was a big issue at the time, and everybody shows up at like 5 in the morning because evictions always happen before sunrise for some reason. So you have to get up early, get your equipment, make sure your batteries are charged. Anyway, so we're there at this eviction scene, and there's all a bunch of supporters in a big circle around the people who are going to be arrested, who are volunteering to be arrested. In other words, they're not going to move when the cops come in and tell them they got to move. And we're singing, everybody's singing, and then when it came time for the arrest, our tape deck stopped working. It got jammed or something, and all of a sudden we weren't able to record anymore. So Pujipal just put his microphone, gave me his microphone, and he went into the circle of people to be arrested and was arrested just in support of them. And he had to go to court with everybody, afterwards, So that's how close we are to being activist filmmakers.
And I'd imagine too that your work in turn inspired a lot of activism. I mean, definitely, like for instance with Mauna Kea, like this is like what you documented there is continued to be like people still refer to this film as we're talking about Mauna Kea in more recent years. So for Joan, if you know, like, do you know like the kind of impact you've had on activists, and maybe Leanne, if you know too, if you could speak, or if you weigh in on this.
Go ahead, Leanne.
I was going to have you go first. However, yes, the Maka o Āina has so much influence over what has happened in the years that they were starting out to now, to recent years. And I notice, say we show Mauna Kea Temple Under Siege at a film festival, or we stream it or something, all of a sudden we see more activity, more questions coming up, more what can I do? And it was a different topic in Temple Under Siege, or not a different topic, but a different impetus of what's got everyone up in arms than the 2015 protest, but it's all the same. It's all just a continuation of the fight. And as Joan brought up, I wanted to add one of the things where we do have allies and we have people that want to help the fight. It is the historical trauma that we hold as indigenous people, Native Hawaiians, that really, it's in our DNA now, and it brews up. So when we do see something from the Maka o Āina, or see something like Cane Fire, it brews up in us, and we're like, okay, we have to do something about it. So that's how I look at it.
Yeah, and it really made a difference with Mauna Kea, because I'm sorry, Anthony.
Oh no, please.
Is that you?
No.
See, we've been around so long that our programs which were shown in the schools a lot and on public access, those people who watched it when they were kids are now teachers themselves, or they're adults now, and they're showing the programs to the younger generation. So it's kind of like going down the generations. And so when the recent Mauna Kea protests started coming up, and like Leanne mentioned, 2015 onward, it just exploded. The activism, and not just the activism, but the coverage. Pujipal and I were our jaws were dropping when we were watching all the live streaming coming up from the mountain, the documentaries that have been made since then. Everybody had cameras. The issue just went viral, as they say. And we were thinking, here, we had to apply to Leanne's organization for funding to do a 1-hour documentary. It took us 6 years, which were wonderful years. But I mean, and it aired twice on PBS Hawaii and a few stations in the United States. And all of a sudden, these young kids with their cell phones were bringing the issue to the worldwide, in just a short amount of time with no funding. And I just thought, we were just so happy to see that. It's really shown the progress, that technology makes possible. But I have to say, the 6 years we spent making Mauna Kea were just wonderful, wonderful, because just getting to know that mountain. And we lived down in Ka'u in the southern part of the island, so we were on the road a lot. We'd leave at 3 a.m. trying to get up to the summit before the sunrise, so we could catch this phenomenon that legends are named after Ku Kaha'ula. The way the snow turns pink and red in the early rays of the sun, and there's a whole legend associated with that. And we wanted to show the mountain in all the different seasons of the year, from the summit and from the bottom, from sea level, and then all the levels of the mountain where the mamane grow and the rainforest grows and the dryland forest, and then the alpine system. And when you're up at that elevation, which is close to 14,000 feet, it's like, when you're at the summit, it's like half the oxygen that you have at sea level. So you have to really watch out. And that's why there's a kapu on the mountain, really. I mean, it's not only a sacred spiritual place, but it can be fatal if you're caught in the wrong place and the wrong weather up there. You got to be careful. And but it was just blissful. I think maybe because of the lack of oxygen, we were just, every time we were up there in the snow or whatever, it was just blissful. We were just so happy whenever we were on the mountain. But after we finished, we never hardly went up there again, because there is this tradition of, you only go up there if you have a reason to be there. That was a blessing to do that program too.
Anthony, did you want to add anything?
Oh, I just wanted to add that, I, through the film, wanted to, I guess from an artistic expression, get it to people that will process action differently, labor activists, sovereignty activists. I had some response from some PhD candidates that are studying history in Hawaii or their roots in the Philippines, that are drawing all these connections that I never would have. And, I don't want to pretend that I was just totally distanced in this kind of journalistic way. I definitely had a point of view, and I wanted to reach and kind of spark these conversations in whatever way I could, whatever tool or whatever, through film. So that was definitely important to me.
I wanted to combine a few questions that we're getting in the audience, which is great. I'm glad that people are asking questions. And a lot of people are interested in sort of what's happening now. So I wanted to ask, Stacey has a question about how do you feel like the awareness of sovereignty struggles have changed in the last few decades, whether because of your film or not? I mean, I know for a fact, like watching your film, I could never look at Hawaii the same way again, period. And I suspect it's like that for many people. So this is either for Joan, actually for Leanne too, because you're also involved with like booking these films or like connecting with people who want to show it. I'm curious, like, how do you feel like the awareness and maybe hunger for these kinds of stories have changed or not through the decades?
I think there was a general renaissance that started in the 1970s, more of an awareness of Hawaiian culture, Hawaiian language, Hawaiian history. And we were just part of that. you know, and there were a lot of movements that started happening that we were documenting, but they would have happened whether we were around or not. So by the time you got up to the Mauna Kea, the recent Mauna Kea activities, there were so many of the younger generation that knew their history. They'd studied their history, they knew their language, they knew their chants. And instead of being protesters like in the old days, you know, hell no, we won't go, and all those slogans we used to have back in the, you know, the early days, they're not doing that. They're not doing it that way anymore. They're doing their chants, and they're doing their hakas and their hulas, and everything is coming from their culture, from their history, from their language. And that to me, and we were a small part of that, I'm sure, because of, you know, media plays a role. But I think it was a general zeitgeist that kind of changed over the years. A lot more people studying in schools and getting their PhDs now. And even active war is really out of date as far as, you know, politically and legally how it's presented. There's so many people now who are just, you know, uncovering and reanalyzing history and saying, no, it's not just something that, oh, those poor Hawaiians, shouldn't we give them sovereignty or something? No. It was a violation of international law. And legally, the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists because nothing ever happened legally to change that, you know. That I don't know whether that answers your question, the question from the viewer or not.
Yeah, it's what Joan says. It now turned into act smarter or work smarter, not harder. And we have so many professionals now that can go into the colonizer system and to play their game rather than us getting bulldozed by their laws and by the way things have been done. So now it's getting into the systems, taking people to court, trying to find the loopholes and closing them, getting paid back for millions of dollars that haven't been paid, for trust lands, for getting back lands. It's just so many things are happening at the same time. It does seem quieter, and it does seem like maybe nothing's happening, but it's happening. It's just, like I said, happening in a smarter, more knowledgeable fashion. And we'll start seeing changes happening. We are seeing changes happening. But I was going to mention, Joan, can you tell everyone about Mauna Kea Temple Under Siege and its award from, was it last year?
It's the National Film Registry.
Yeah, it's not an award, but it was named to the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress, which I thought was, when I first read it, I thought this must be some mistake. The other films, Lilies of the Field, you know, I mean, these other films that were put on the same list, they do 25 a year. I couldn't believe it. But my theory is that whoever's on these boards that judge, you know, what's going to go on the list, I think they were really influenced by the recent happenings on Mauna Kea. And that was all from other filmmakers who are making documentaries, and also, like I say, these live streams that were going out every day. And, you know, movie stars were showing up on the mountain because they held the occupation up there for more, you know, around a year or so. People were coming from all over the world, all over the Pacific, and a lot of movie stars were showing up and paying their tribute to the protectors of Mauna Kea. And I think that might have gotten around, you know, like the buzz kind of happened both in the world of film too, you know. So I think maybe that might have influenced people who are making a decision on what film should go on the registry. So I have those young filmmakers to thank, or we, Pujipal and I do.
You're also modest because the film is great. So I think that's also a reason too. I'm actually curious though, because I mean, as much as it's an honor, is it strange for you to be kind of inducted into a national like film registry by the colonizer, right? Like they're like integrating you into their archive and their history.
We'll take it.
Well, it's kind of like what Leanne's saying, right? Like, knowing how to work the system, like being part of it, so to get more visibility, and it certainly has. I'm glad for that.
Well, Pujipal was asked on a panel in Berlin, at the Berlin Film Festival one time. He said, "You're getting money from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Isn't that the American government? Why are you taking money from them?" And he said, "Hey, they owe us much more."
Love it. So this is also tied to one of the other questions, and where the person asks, just like, where does the struggle for Hawaiian sovereignty stand now? And Joan, you had alluded to like how 1993, what was going on then, is sort of is now even outdated. So I'm curious, like, if you could just fill us in on what you know about where the sovereignty movement is now.
Yeah, kind of like Leanne said, things seem kind of quiet, but what's building up and what everybody realized is that there needs to be more education. Education has to happen before. You can't just have you can't have a revolution. It's not going to work, or a violent revolution. And Hawaii has never been violent. Well, in 1893, there was not a violent response to the U.S. troops landing and stuff like that. The Queen forbade it. She said, no, we'll rely on the justice of the United States, and when they understand what happened, they'll make things right. So, and plus, when you're a little island, you only have so many people. If you try anything, you're going to get squashed by the powers that be. So people knew from the beginning. This has to happen organically, and that's what's happening. Actually, like I said, there's more people getting their PhDs. Like Leanne said, they're exposing the history, and they're exposing the history to a worldwide audience of jurists and other legal international law experts, and then plus locally, people are just learning a lot more. The Hawaiian newspapers are being digitized; those stories are coming out, and I think what's going to happen. My own theory is that it's just going to happen organically. People are going to realize that Hawaii needs to govern itself. It's a group of islands. It has nothing to do with a continent. It has nothing to do with the laws that are made for a continent whose capital is 5,000 miles away. Where is your allegiance? Even the non-Hawaiians who live here, what is your allegiance to? Where is your allegiance? Do you love this land? Do you want to protect this land? Do you love the people, the cultures that have arisen, grown up here? And I think there's just going to be Keanu Sai, one of the best people who has uncovered all this new and historical analysis. He said back in 1893, there were only a few people that masterminded the overthrow. Only a few people. And of course, they have the help and the backing of the huge might of the United States. But it wouldn't have happened except for like 16 people in this committee or whatever. And he said it was like they flipped the Honu, the turtle, over on its back. And since then, it's been flailing around, And he said, so it would only take a few people to right the turtle back on its, on the right side again. It doesn't have to be everybody getting involved in some revolution. And I have to say that, like, I've seen instances of that, like in British Columbia and also in Australia, where the high courts of both those places, in reviewing the historical evidence, came out with rulings that said, yes, this is all Aboriginal land. The land title was never given or transferred to the colonizers. So just making that basis of fact, and they also called for a 2-year moratorium, at least in British Columbia, on any land transactions, because they knew there'd be a lot of people upset about knowing that their land wasn't owned by them, So, but just if a populace knows that this is all Aboriginal land, then they can start to work things out, in ways that very much reflect aloha. And I know that's a very broad concept, but it's the first thing people notice when they come here. They think locals are stupid. I mean, I've seen that reaction because people have so much aloha. They don't interrupt you. They don't contradict you. They accept you the way you are, unless you're threatening them or something. And I just feel that Hawaii could lead the way in showing how wrongs can be righted, and that the turtle can come back on its feet again. Flippers.
Well, this reminds me that I'm curious, how were you and Pujipal in touch with other indigenous media makers around the world, right? You have that great film about when you're in Yamagata at the big sort of gathering of indigenous media makers. So I'm curious, like the kinds of conversations you were having with other folks throughout the world.
Yeah. Every film festival we went to had indigenous representation, and a lot of times they had a push for it. Like Mera Tamita was one of the judges in the Yamagata for the main venue, and she was constantly railing against the organization of the film festival organization, saying, "Why are you putting the indigenous people over in this tent across the street from the main venue?" We were in a big tent, and it was cold at night. It was hot in the daytime. But yeah, we met a lot of and corresponded with a lot of indigenous filmmakers everywhere. And we got invited to their places, and there was a lot of and there's much more going on right now. I know there's a lot more collaboration going on between indigenous filmmakers, and a lot of them need help. They really need help. They need support. So as much as they can be given that from Leanne and other people.
Yeah, Leanne, can you speak to kind of the work that you do with other indigenous media makers around the world?
So what we're set up to do is provide funding for Pacific Islander stories from media makers throughout the world. If you're outside of the US, you can get a fiscal sponsor in the US to work with us. And you know, we just want to bring as many stories about Pacific Islanders to the world. Our first stop is National PBS and getting on there, but we also work with so many film festivals such as San Diego Asian Film Festival to get the stories out, have these panels, and just educate. Like we were saying earlier, education is the key. I remember when I marched in the March of 1993. I was there. I felt empowered, yet I didn't really understand, exactly what happened. I just knew I showed up, and then throughout the years, with more and more education, things like Joan just brought up, how it was just a handful of people that it took to overthrow, American businessmen that it took to overthrow the government and bring the might of the Marines over. Stuff like that. It wakes you up, it makes you woke. And which my daughter said, never say that word again, Mom. But it does. And you get incensed, and then you want to do something about it, and you want to tell others. And so that's what we do at PIC. We want the content creators, the media makers, to come to us, and we can help tell the story to the masses.
So this is kind of related to a question that Helen is asking, and this is for Joan, but I'm actually curious how Anthony would respond too. Her question is, what advice would you have for non-Indigenous people showing up in Indigenous spaces to make sure that you are centering the Indigenous perspective rather than just through the lens of the dominant culture?
Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, that's a good question. When I started the project, I was focused on my family. My great-grandfather who immigrated from the Philippines, he was an immigrant settler to Hawaii. And I was very excited about the labor movement, just because living in New York right now, it's studying unions and organization was something I was proud of, that I was able to organize under terrible conditions as a worker in the pineapple and sugar fields. And that was kind of my entry. And I knew that that they were working under these conditions that looked at land ownership differently in Hawaii than the sovereign community. And once I learned more about that and began talking to different sovereignty groups, you know, it was important that they were in whatever vision that's in the future of this, whatever coalition, that they would have, it would be them that was leading the way, and that you could be an ally to that, but that, you know, they're this sort of self-determination that they are in control of whatever this vision is, and I see them as very compatible, but it's up to them to actually have the final say in that. And just being aware of that, you can kind of offer your support, but knowing that you know, there's going to be a conflict. There's a different way of seeing things. I came from a very Western view of Hawaii, and and I'm actually encouraged in a way. I mean, with documentary organizations, some that are, and institutions still see that way. And I was encouraged to take certain routes in telling the story that were not really honoring the sovereignty movement, because it was, you know, kind of a liberal way of kind of poking at issues, but not really taking any sides, or really, you know, investing in what one group is saying. And so it was a long education process of actually listening and absorbing and respecting that point of view, and centering that first. And that was kind of what led the film the rest of the way, with that guidance.
He said a very important word there, listening. And that would be my recommendation to people like me. Listen, shut up and listen. I don't want to be rude, but I know from personal experience that, you know, I came rolling in here, you know, very much saying, I know best. You know, I know how to do this better than you. You know, I mean, it took a long time to get over that. So I think if you get into the practice of just listening, you're going to find out how you can help. The ways are going to be made available to you to help in whatever way the people here want you to help, not the way you want to help. You know? And I say that especially to non-Indigenous filmmakers, you know, who have a history of coming to Hawaii and gathering all this footage of people's cultural values and their language and the beauty of Hawaii, and then going off somewhere, you know, and making a film, you know, which more than likely will have wrong, you know, errors in it that are very insulting to the culture and to the people. So, anyway, I've had far too much influence on filmmaking from Hawaii, and I'm so happy that there's Indigenous filmmakers coming up, Hawaiian filmmakers coming up, that Leanne is supporting them, and it's just really blossoming right now. And I can go back and make documentaries about my Italian ancestors or something.
Well, Leanne, I actually would love to hear from your perspective on this too, because you often do fund non-Indigenous filmmakers who are coming into Hawaii, or sometimes you probably don't fund them. you make that determination. So I'd love to kind of hear from your perspective too.
It's an ongoing discussion. I remember we held a conference, the Hawaiian Media Makers Conference in 2016, and it turned into the panel, I'm sorry, turned into not a shouting match, but everyone trying to give their idea of who tells the story. And from my point of view, if a non-Pacific Islander or a non-Indigenous person is telling the story, then be an ally. Now we have that word. We used to say, be a friend, be a mentor. And bring in as many Pacific Islanders that you can as cultural advisors, as key crew people to help tell that story. Because yes, everyone comes to their project with their perception, with their lens. And everyone's is different, and it's great to be influenced by the people around you, because it takes a village to make a film. So when we do offer funding, and when they send in a proposal, we ask, who is on your crew? Who is your cultural advisor? What is your training proposal? Because we want Pacific Islanders to be trained up so they in turn can tell their own story. And, you know, there's never a, what is that word? We'll never run out of stories. We will always have stories. We can do 1 million on Mauna Kea alone, and or 1 million on the unions and how it affected Hawaii, etc. And it'll each come from that director's perspective or that team. And just the more stories out there, the better. So we make sure we not only train Pacific Islander filmmakers, media makers, new media that are coming up, but whoever else wants to join along, our allies, our storytellers here and abroad that want to tell Pacific Islander stories. Because how lucky are we that these stories are going out globally and just educating the masses.
And I do appreciate when you're saying like getting them on your cruise, because I think as Carmela says in the chat, like honoring their labor and making sure they get paid. That seems pretty critical. I think one of the other important legacies of Maka Āina is actually right behind you, Joan. Like what we're all seeing in the back, like these tapes. Which when you stepped into the chat and I saw that in your background, I was so moved by this image. I'm also like an archive nerd, but still, like it's it's so precious. And I'm sure Anthony would agree because he has clips from your films in his own work. And so I'm curious, like how this licensing, and because I've seen clips from your films in other people's works. Is this a sustainable model for your company today?
Licensing footage?
Right. Yeah. I mean, is this something that can be part of your legacy, like an ongoing work that you do?
Oh yeah. It doesn't bring in that much, and I end up giving footage away a lot to people who don't have the money. But anyway, I'm so happy you brought up the archive. Because I'm just struggling like crazy to get out of this analog world and into the digital world, but I know it's not going to happen before I die. I probably have we've probably shot about 8,000 tapes here, you know, from half-inch reel-to-reel black and white footage to 3/4-inch U-matic tape to Betacam, DV cam, DV tape. Anyway, fortunately, we have the Ulu Ulu Moving Image Archive of Hawaii, which was started by Heather Dooney, and it's now at the University of Hawaii. It takes up a whole floor at the West Oahu campus. And they have a vault that's climate controlled. It has 1.5 miles of moving shelving. Heather and Janelle Quirante, who's the head archivist, are collecting everybody's film and video collections and saving them there and digitizing them. So so that's where all this is going to go eventually, but I don't want to let go of it just yet because I'm still cataloging it, and cataloging is a very time intensive, you know, process. And if you're an archive nerd, Brian, you probably know what I'm talking about. You have to enter, you know, all this metadata for every single tape, you know, when was it shot, who was on the crew, who's in it, what was the location, the date. And it's all very important information, because when this archive goes to Ulu Ulu, I don't want somebody 50 years from now who's digitizing some tape going, now who is this and where was this shot? You know, I want all that information to be right there. And also, we did a really good job over the years of logging and transcribing our tapes. So just those logs and transcripts, even before the video is all digitized, which is happening on a piecemeal basis, just reading through transcripts can be very valuable to scholars and to the, you know, our main goal is to save this for the families of the people on these tapes. Because I myself know how precious it is to find an old photograph of your ancestor or something, some material souvenir of their life. You know, it's so important. And I'm sure that the grandchildren of the people on these tapes don't even know this footage exists. So it really needs to be preserved. It needs to be digitized, and we're working on that. And I need help if anybody wants to help.
Well, I do want to know, like, how can we help? But it's also, it's like what you're saying is so interesting, because that's what Cane Fire.
Money.
Oh yeah, yeah. If there's a way for us to help, we would love to help get the word out. If you have like a fundraiser or something like that. But yeah, a lot of what you're saying really resonates with what we saw in Cane Fire, which is very much about like somebody looking for footage of their grandparents. So actually, so for Anthony, like, what, as a filmmaker, as a documentarian who works in the archive or is very uses the archive, like what kind of challenges do you see going like that, especially in Hawaii, like in terms of preservation and archiving, and what would make it easier for you as a filmmaker to keep these images alive?
When it came to more local photographs and images in Kauai specifically, you know, it was an issue. Money is an issue again, because it's a small operation, the Historical Society, and they're actually getting more material than they can actually catalog. And, you know, because if there's families that have passed on and they leave behind their photographs, there's so much information that still boxes and boxes that they haven't gone through. There was actually a kind of what I thought was a key set of photos that I use in the film that I had not seen anywhere else, really just came from them letting me sit in a room for a day and going through unmarked photos and finding when you see in the film of these first housing developments when the plantation workers were negotiating new plots of land. I had never seen that anywhere in a book or anywhere, and there it was, just, you know, slightly mildewy, you know, in this old box. And yeah, that seems to be a big challenge, is getting through this material, especially with decaying old film footage as well. You get an old canister of 8mm footage of, you know, industrial films from the plantation era. Yeah, that seems to be a big challenge, to be able to archive all that and have the funds to do it.
Well, yeah, if there's a way for us to help get the word out, because this is the kind of thing that is not often talked about in in representation, right? Like, it's also representation of our own archives, and to make sure that they continue.
I'm gonna help Joan. Please. I'm gonna take a look at grants and for different archiving purposes, and work with Joan on that. And also, she mentioned Ulu Ulu, which takes all types of moving videos, images, and they also take in collections and then get grants to help them with certain things they're doing to the collection. I understand, though, that Joan wants to hold on to it until it can be archived, then give it over to Ulu Ulu. So we'll take a look at that aspect, Joan, and see what they have. And maybe something with the University of Hawaii at Hilo.
Oh, I know. I'm so tired of writing grants all my life that I got real lazy in my old age. And I just look at a grant application, I just go, ah! I just want to find somebody who, anyway, never mind.
So I'll take a look.
Mahalo, Leanne. I appreciate that. It's so much easier when you don't have to go through a funder, a government agency.
I wanted to make sure, we're already over an hour, and I'm enjoying this conversation so much, and also from hearing from everybody in the comments. But I do want to make sure that we speak a little bit about Pujipal. I mean, as Leanne mentioned, this is the 5th anniversary of his passing, and I'm curious, like, what do you all see as his legacy, his like unique contribution to documentary and to Hawaii? I mean, that's a big question, but I mean, like, I've never met him, but I like from his work, I feel like I feel a personality there, especially when he's on the screen too. So I'm just curious, like, if anyone wants to share any feelings about his legacy. Yeah, please.
We could start out by introducing the audience to his name, Pujipal, which he was not given at birth. His legal name is Abraham Ahmad Jr., and that reflects the fact that his father was Palestinian. So that's where the Ahmad came from, and his mother was pure Hawaiian from this island, Hawaii. And but he had seen a genealogical chart one time. Well, first of all, when he would talk with other Hawaiians, they'd look at him, he'd tell them his name, and they'd look at him and go, "Are you Hawaiian?" Yeah, because he introduced himself as Abraham Ahmad. So he kind of got tired of that, and he wanted to take on a Hawaiian name. And he looked at his family's genealogy chart, and way up at the top in the 1700s, it said Pujipal, Puhipau. So he said, that's going to be my name. So he started taking it on. He never legally changed it, although he used it all the time. It was on his credit cards and everything. But, and when one of the first programs we did together was this program about a theoretical nuclear attack on Hawaii that was the Physicians for Social Responsibility wanted us to do. It was back in the 80s when this whole nuclear awareness thing was going on about the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So we did a program about what would happen in Hawaii if a 20 megaton bomb was exploded over Pearl Harbor. And what would happen like at ground zero, what would happen 5 miles out, 10 miles out, 20 miles out. Anyway, when it got around time to finding a title, we thought we'd name it Pujipal, because we thought Puhi is to blow, that's one of the meanings, and Pau is the last or the end, or finished or something like that. So we thought it would be kind of analogous to the last breath if a nuclear bomb went over Hawaii, And but then we met somebody in the airport serendipitously, and they said, Pujipal is actually a Hawaiian term. Look it up in the dictionary. So we went to the dictionary, and it's in the old edition of the dictionary, not the new one. And it said Pujipal, blown away, completely burnt. And we went, wow, talk about a name, an appropriate title for a program about nuclear destruction. And but as you read the meanings, it says blown away, completely burnt. A meaning to the kauna, or the deeper meaning, is to blow away the dust and reveal the secrets. And Pujipal just loved that even more, because that's what he thought he was doing with video. It's just blowing away the dust and all these beautiful secrets of Hawaiian stories and history and language and culture and environment and the birds and the everything, the wildlife. And so he kind of took that as his little used that name a lot, Pujipal. Anyway, and I think that's kind of what he did. And personally, when he ever talked, we would be on shoots all the time, and he would, of course, Hawaiians would come up and want to talk story all the time, and he would just get into these long talks with people, and even non-Hawaiians. He would just blow them away, literally. I mean, with what he said, because it was stuff that they'd never heard before, and it was stuff they'd never heard from Hawaiians in general. Like like I think you were saying it, or somebody was saying, Hawaiians are kind of like have a face to the world of being aloha and gentle and stuff like that, but they don't often hear the anger or the intensity of feeling that comes out from years and years and generations of just being under somebody's thumb, so that would come out with Pujipal, and the veins would stand out on his neck, and I get kind of worried for his health, and sometimes I would say, Pujipal, how they always say, honey will attract more people than vinegar. And because he could really sway people very easily with his words of being inclusive and everything. But sometimes that anger would come out when he would see that person was not getting it. The anger would come out, and I'd say to myself, well, people need to see the anger. Maybe people need to see the anger, or otherwise they would think everything's hunky-dory. So I was so blessed to be able to work with him. I thank him every day. I talk to him all the time, ask for advice, and I believe that he's helping out.
And as you mentioned before we began, he's behind us right now. There he
is up on the wall.
Leanne,
for asking that, Brian, and also mahalo for all the online coverage of our programs. I just love the little bits that you pull out of some of our documentaries, the quotations, and put the picture there. The best one is Mauna Kea. The one from Mauna Kea says, "Great science, wrong mountain." And I went, talk about putting the whole message into like 4 words. That was great.
Our social media team will be very happy to hear this.
It's a quote from the documentary, so somebody actually said that, and I apologize for not giving him credit. I have it anyway. But mahalo for all the and the way all of your mana'o is very much appreciated, and I think Pujipal would appreciate it too, Brian. Mahalo.
Thank you.
My recollection of Pujipal is larger than life, so akamai, so smart, so much knowledge and wisdom, and gentle giant. And like Joan said, very even keel to a point. You don't poke the bear, you know? And that can be said of all Hawaiians. Like Joan mentioned earlier, we can be very generous and giving and try to help you out any way possible. But if you start taking advantage of that, then, you know, it's going to stop and you'll see another side of anyone you do that to. But I did want to mention that although I do remember Pujipal fondly and I miss him, I still think of Na Maka Āina as a team and a pair. And without one, we couldn't have the other. And they're just a beautiful, symbiotic relationship. And that's how I remember you, both of you.
And Anthony, I don't know if you, I'm assuming you've never met Pujipal, but I'm just curious also, like, based on what you do know or based on what you've heard today, like, I'm curious what you take from this.
Yeah, I love Joan's story, and unfortunately, I wasn't able to meet him, but getting to learn about him through Sand Island, and then first seeing him through the Waimanalo eviction, his address to camera he was looking right at the camera, and it's, you know, it has this presence. He's not overworking the words. It's not like a news broadcast. It's very, has a solemn feel to it, and the narration. It's just a great presence all through the films.
That's funny you should say that, because we actually were trying to make it like a news broadcast at the time.
It was like its own twist.
Because we were feeding stories back then to CNN once in a while, and we try to open up like a regular, reporter on the scene would do. Yeah. Even though that was totally antithetical to everything we ever did.
He didn't do the quite up and down raising of the he was like kind of in the middle. I really like the delivery.
Well, we did about 20 takes. So thank you for that.
Well, I mean, we're way past time, but I'm so grateful that everyone shared your time and this theme of sharing, right, that we've been talking about, like that. I'm so glad that we were able to do this. And I don't know if you've been able to look at the comments, but the audiences are. They're very, very grateful as well, and a lot of hearts are in the chat.
Are amazing. You got a great team here, or fans, great fan base, Brian.
Oh, I have been missing the comments all this time. Anyway.
All right. Well, thank you again. Thank you to our audience, Joan in particular. Thank you for making these films re-available to our audiences. I know many are seeing these films for the first time, and I hope that they continue to share the word, not just about the stories, but also about you and Pujipal and your contributions, which I think are kind of monumental. Thank you, Leanne, for what?
You're on Vimeo. If you want to see them, you can get them on Vimeo.
Yeah, actually, please tell us how we can access these films, rent them.
We have a website, hawaiianvoice.com, and it lists all of our 100 or so documentaries. And people are actually still ordering DVDs, believe it or not. But if you don't have a DVD player anymore, some of our major productions are available on demand on Vimeo. And if you go to our website, you'll be directed to those that are available on demand. So that helps our archiving efforts just by purchasing. And they're cheap. Hopefully they're cheap enough. You get a 72-hour window. And it's much more earth-friendly to go on demand instead of DVD distribution. Mahalo for that, Brian. I appreciate it.
And I hope that if there are any educators in the audience, if they can license these films for their libraries, for their classrooms.
Yeah, that's most of our distribution actually is to educational institutions and libraries.
Great. And thank you, Leanne, as always, for not just for being here today, but for all of the years of making these films available and accessible around the world. And of course, also for supporting our film festival, for which we're ever grateful.
Well, thank you for allowing us to celebrate our 30th with you and to celebrate our partnership and the beginning of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. That's great. And for celebrating these two great documentarian filmmakers, artists, and all that they're contributing to perpetuation of our heritage and culture. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Anthony, too. You came back a week later. You came back for more. And so it's always great to hear your perspective, too.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
And of course, thank you to our audience for participating. This is, as Leanne mentioned, this is the first day of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And as somebody's in the comments said, like this is the kind of conversation that should be beginning that month, right? Like the conversations that usually don't happen first. I think it's important.
But remember, we're more than a month.
We're more, yeah, exactly. And we should be supported for a year round. If people want to be part of more conversations, we have another Q&A tomorrow for our closing film, Try Harder, which is a brand new film that was at Sundance this year. So if anybody hasn't had a chance to watch that film yet, please, you still have 24 hours to do so to participate in the Q&A tomorrow. And of course, if some of you only saw one of the 3 Maka Āina films, or 1 or 2, or you hadn't seen all 3 yet, they're still available for another day through the Spring Showcase. So please do so. All right, as always, thank you all. And we hope to see everyone in person soon. Thank you.
Yeah.
Aloha.